In the serene town of Frederick, Colorado, the Watts family appeared to embody the quintessential American dream. Chris Watts, a dedicated employee at Anadarko Petroleum, and his wife Shanann, a thriving entrepreneur with a robust social media presence, were proud parents to two young daughters, Bella, aged 4, and Celeste, aged 3. Shanann was also 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. In the days leading up to August 13th, 2018, the Watts family of Frederick, Colorado, appeared to be living an idyllic suburban life. Chris Watts, 33, was employed by Anadarko Petroleum, while his wife, Shanann, 34, thrived as a promoter for a wellness company. Their social media profiles painted a picture of domestic bliss, with frequent posts showcasing their affection for each other and their two young daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Shanann was also 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. However, beneath this veneer of happiness, tensions were simmering. Friends and family had noticed a change in Chris's behavior over the summer. He had become distant, often avoiding family gatherings and displaying a lack of interest in Shanann's pregnancy. Unbeknownst to Shanann, Chris had begun an affair with a co-worker, Nickel Kessinger, in early July 2018. Kessinger later told investigators that Chris had portrayed himself as a man in the midst of a separation, concealing the reality of his still intact family life. In late July, Shanann took their daughters to North Carolina to visit family, while Chris remained in Colorado, ostensibly due to work commitments. During this period, Chris's communication with Shanann became sporadic and detached. He frequently ignored her calls and messages, opting instead to spend time with Kessinger. Phone records later revealed that Chris and Kessinger exchanged numerous calls and messages, some lasting over an hour during this time. Upon Chris's arrival in North Carolina in early August to join his family, Shanann noticed a stark difference in his demeanor. He was physically present but emotionally absent, often avoiding intimacy and engaging minimally with their daughters. Shanann confided in friends about her concerns, expressing fears that Chris was no longer interested in their marriage. In text messages later, recovered by investigators, Shanann wrote to a friend, "He has changed. I don't know who he is. He hasn't touched me all week, kissed me, talked to me." During their stay in North Carolina, an incident occurred that further strained their relationship. Shanann discovered that Chris's parents had given ice cream containing nuts to Celeste, who had a severe nut allergy. Feeling that her concerns were being dismissed, Shanann confronted Chris about his family's disregard for their daughter's health. This confrontation led to a heated argument, with Chris accusing Shanann of creating unnecessary drama and driving a wedge between him and his family. On August 7th, Shanann drafted a heartfelt letter to Chris, expressing her feelings of abandonment and pleading for him to work on their marriage. She wrote, "I try to fix things and make them better, and this is making me crazy. I know I can be a pain in the ass. I am sorry I am not what you need." Despite her efforts, Chris remained distant, often retreating into silence or leaving the house without explanation. As their trip came to an end, Shanann hoped that returning to Colorado would help mend their fractured relationship. She planned a romantic getaway for their upcoming anniversary and organized a gender reveal party for their unborn son, believing that these events would rekindle their bond. However, Chris's mind was elsewhere. He had been researching vacation spots with Kessinger and had even discussed the possibility of a future together, free from the responsibilities of his current life. On August 9th, Shanann left for a business trip to Arizona, leaving Chris with their daughters. During her trip, she continued to reach out to Chris, sending him ultrasound images and expressing her excitement about their growing family. Chris's responses were curt and lacked enthusiasm, further deepening Shanann's anxiety. She confided in a friend, saying, "He hasn't said I love you back to me in a week. He hasn't touched me or really talked to me." While Shanann was away, Chris's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He hired a babysitter under the pretense of attending a baseball game with coworkers, but instead took Kessinger out on a date. He also began withdrawing large sums of money from their joint bank account, which Shanann noticed and questioned. Chris dismissed her concerns, attributing the expenses to work-related costs. On August 12th, The day before Shanann's return, Chris and Kessinger spent the day together, during which Chris told her that his divorce was final and that he and Shanann were no longer living together. This was a blatant lie, as Shanann was still very much invested in their marriage and unaware of Chris's infidelity. In the early hours of August 13th, Shanann returned home, hoping to resolve the tensions that had plagued their relationship. Unbeknownst to her, Chris had already made a decision that would shatter their family and shock the nation. The subsequent investigation would reveal a web of deceit, betrayal, and cold-blooded calculation, leading to one of the most harrowing cases of familicide in recent history. Shanann Watts' flight from Arizona had been delayed, and it wasn't until nearly 2 a.m. that she arrived back at her home on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado. Surveillance footage from the neighbor's motion-activated security camera shows Shanann stepping out of her friend Nicole Atkinson's white car. She retrieves her suitcase, slings her purse over her shoulder, and walks toward the front door. She disappears inside. The door shuts. It is the last time Shanann Watts is seen alive. Inside, the house is silent. Chris Watts is awake. Bella and Celeste are asleep in their rooms. For the next few minutes, Shanann moves about the house, likely checking on the girls and preparing for bed. What happened next was never captured on camera, but by Chris Watts' later confession, it was inside their bedroom that he ended her life. According to Chris, Shanann confronted him about their marriage. She wanted to fix things. She asked if he was still in love with her. Chris later claimed he told her he no longer loved her and that he wanted a separation. Shanann, devastated, reportedly told him, "You're never going to see the kids again." What followed was a violent struggle. Chris climbed over her, straddling her on the bed, and placed his hands around her throat. He squeezed. Shanann fought back. At some point, Bella, the 4-year-old, entered the room. In a quiet voice, she asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" Chris told her that Shanann was sick and that they needed to take her to the hospital. But there was no hospital. By sunrise, the Watts home was silent once again. But inside the garage, in the shadows, Chris was preparing for what came next. He backed his work truck into the driveway, something he had never done before. Their neighbor's security camera captured the movement. Inside, Bella and Celeste were awake. Chris wrapped their mother's lifeless body in a sheet and dragged her down the stairs. The girls, still dressed in their pajamas, watched. He loaded Shanann's body onto the floor of the truck. Then he picked up Bella. Then Celeste. He placed them in the back seat. They were alive. For the next 45 minutes, the truck sat idling in the driveway. No one saw what happened inside, but Chris later admitted that Bella and Celeste were crying softly, holding on to each other as he pulled out of the driveway and drove toward the oil field. This was no ordinary drive. The location was remote, an oil storage facility owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. No one else was supposed to be there. Chris parked near 2 massive oil tanks. He stepped out of the truck, then opened the rear door. First, he took Shanann's body from the floor and carried her a few yards away, digging a shallow grave in the dirt. He placed her body inside and covered it. Then, he turned back to the truck. Celeste was the first. Chris took his daughter out of her car seat, pressed her face into a blanket, and held it there until she stopped moving. He carried her up the ladder to the top of the oil tank and pushed her body inside the opening. Bella, the eldest, had watched everything. She knew. She pleaded, "Daddy, please don't do to me what you did to Cece." But Chris did. Bella's autopsy would later reveal that she fought. She had bitten her tongue. She struggled against her father's grip. When it was over, he lifted her body up the ladder and pushed her into the second tank. It was done. Chris climbed down, dusted himself off, and drove away as if nothing had happened. Back in Frederick, Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, was growing worried. She had been expecting a text or a call from Shanann after her morning doctor's appointment. There was nothing. Nicole messaged her repeatedly, no response. She tried again, still nothing. Then she checked the Watts home security system. She could see that Shanann had never left the house that morning. Nicole called Chris. His voice was calm. He told her Shanann had taken the kids on a play date. But something didn't sit right. Nicole drove to the house. The front door was locked. Shanann's car was still in the garage. Her shoes were inside. Her purse, her medication, everything, untouched. She called 911. Body cam footage from the responding officer captures the moment Chris arrives home. He steps out of his truck, phone in hand, an almost casual expression on his face. He approaches Nicole and the officer. He doesn't ask where his wife is. He doesn't ask why there's a police officer at his house. Instead, he walks up to the door, unlocks it, and steps inside. Inside, the officer begins looking around. Shanann's phone is found on the couch. Her purse and medication are still in the kitchen. The officer asks Chris when he last saw her. This morning, at about 5:15. His voice is flat. His hands are on his hips. He avoids eye contact. The officer notes the wedding ring left on the nightstand. A turning point in the investigation comes minutes later when the neighbor invites the officer into his home. On the screen, they watch the security footage. It shows Chris Watts at 5:27 a.m., backing his truck into the driveway. They see him moving back and forth, loading something heavy into the truck bed. The truck pulls away at 5:37 a.m. The officer glances at Chris. His arms are crossed. He sways slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looks at the floor. The neighbor waits for the footage to finish, then turns to the officer. "He's not acting right," he whispers. Chris hears this. He lets out a nervous chuckle. Chris stands outside his house, giving a media interview. His voice is calm, measured. "I just want them back." But as the hours pass, investigators start piecing things together. The security footage, the neighbor's suspicions, the inconsistencies in his story. And when Chris Watts finally agrees to take a polygraph test, the case takes a dramatic turn. What he didn't know was that he was about to fail it, miserably. And within 48 hours, the world would learn the truth about what really happened inside the Watts family home. Chris, now the face of a worried husband and father, had spent the day answering calls from detectives, reporters, and concerned friends. Yet something was off. During an on-camera interview outside his home, he stood with his arms crossed, swaying slightly. His voice was even, emotionless. He looked away when speaking about his missing family, his eyes unfocused. I just want them back," he said, pausing. "If somebody has them, bring them back." There were no tears, no sense of urgency, no desperation. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a man struggling to keep himself composed. But to investigators, it was something else entirely. And as his wife's best friend, Nicole Atkinson, later pointed out, Chris Watts was acting very differently from how a grieving husband and father should. Detectives invited Chris to the Frederick Police Department for a voluntary interview. Chris agreed. He walked into the interrogation room wearing a gray t-shirt and shorts, appearing calm. Too calm. The first thing investigators noticed was his breathing. It remained steady. Even as he sat across from the detectives, his hands rested casually in his lap. His demeanor was neutral, unbothered. Detective Tammy Lee, an expert in deception detection, took the lead. "So tell me again, what happened Monday morning?" she asked. Chris sighed and shifted in his chair. "I woke up, got ready for work, talked to Shanann for a little bit. I told her I didn't think this was going to work, and then I left." His voice was steady, but something was off. The words came out rehearsed, practiced, memorized. Tammy nodded, watching him closely. "You left around 5:15 a.m.? Chris nodded. "Yeah, around that time." Tammy leaned forward. "Why was your truck backed into the driveway?" Chris hesitated. A beat of silence. I was just loading up my tools." Detective Lee didn't react. Instead, she shifted gears. "So, when was the last time you saw the girls?" Chris blinked. That morning, they were still in their beds. This was a crucial contradiction. Surveillance footage from the neighbor's security camera already showed Chris loading something into his truck that morning. And the girls weren't asleep in their beds. They were in that truck. Chris Watts had one opportunity to prove himself, a lie detector test. On August 15th, he agreed to take one, perhaps believing he could beat it. FBI polygraph examiner Agent Graham Coder led him into the testing room. The air was still. A camera recorded everything. For nearly 2 hours, Coder walked him through the process, carefully setting the stage. Chris sat in the chair, sensors attached to his arms and fingers, a blood pressure cuff on his bicep. Graham smiled at him. "You know this is a voluntary test, right? You don't have to be here." Chris nodded. "Yeah." Graham paused, then leaned in slightly. I just want to say this. Right now, there's only one person in this room who knows what happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Chris's expression remained neutral. But in about 5 minutes, Graham continued, we're both gonna know. Chris swallowed. The test began. Did you physically hurt Shanann? No. Did you cause her disappearance? No. The sensors picked up on his breathing, his heart rate, his sweating, and the results were immediate. He was lying. Badly. After the test, Graham returned, sitting across from him. He let out a sigh, shaking his head. Chris, he said, lowering his voice, you failed. Chris shifted in his chair, his shoulders rising slightly. I don't know why. Graham didn't let up. There's a reason you failed this test. We know you're lying. This is the time to be honest. Chris pressed his lips together. I didn't hurt her. Then tell me the truth. For the first time since the investigation began, Chris Watts was breaking. After hours of questioning, Chris was left alone in the interrogation room. Detectives had given him an option: tell the truth or they would no longer believe a word he said. Chris sat hunched over the table. His legs bounced anxiously. Then he made a request. He wanted to talk to his father. Chris Watts sat in the cold, windowless interrogation room, his arms crossed over his chest. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of FBI agent Graham Coder's pen against the desk. Chris, the agent said, his voice calm but firm. This is your chance. We know you haven't told us everything. Chris shifted in his seat. His fingers twitched. His face remained blank, but his breathing was shallow. I told you everything I know, he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Detective Tammy Lee leaned forward, studying him. No, Chris, you haven't. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Your father's here. He wants to hear the truth from you. Chris exhaled sharply, as if the air had been knocked out of him. He looked at his hands, then up at the camera mounted in the corner of the room. The door opened, and Ronnie Watts stepped in, his face pale, his eyes filled with an uneasy mix of confusion and dread. He pulled up a chair next to his son. Son? Ronnie's voice wavered. What happened? Chris swallowed hard. He shifted again, rubbing his hands over his face. He whispered something, barely audible. Ronnie leaned in. What? Chris hesitated for just a second longer before he finally said it. She's gone. Ronnie blinked. Who's gone? Chris licked his lips. Shanann, I killed her. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the room. Ronnie recoiled, his face twisting in disbelief. Chris, why? Chris let out a breath. She hurt the girls. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to control the narrative. A lie. One more attempt to paint himself as a man who had simply reacted. But detectives weren't buying it. Tammy Lee's eyes didn't waver. Chris, that's not what happened. Chris's shoulders slumped. His face remained disturbingly neutral, but his body betrayed him. His fingers clenched. His foot tapped the floor. His breath hitched. The truth was coming, and he knew there was no stopping it. Hours later, the story changed. Under relentless questioning, Chris finally admitted what detectives had already suspected. I killed her, he repeated, quieter this time. Tammy didn't blink. And then what? Chris hesitated, staring down at his hands. She was gone. And then Bella walked in. A beat of silence. What did she see? Chris exhaled through his nose. She saw Shanann. And what did she say? She asked, what's wrong with Mommy? Chris's voice was almost childlike now, a stark contrast to the brutality of what he had done. Tammy pressed further. What did you say to her? Chris hesitated. I told her Mommy was sick. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous tick. Tammy let that sink in before asking, what happened next? Chris's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I put her in the truck. The girls? He nodded. Both of them. The words were almost robotic, as if he were describing something mundane, as if he were detached from it all. But the next question from Tammy stopped him cold. How did they die? Chris's lips parted, but no words came out. He shut his eyes for a second before inhaling sharply. Cease first, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then Bella. Tammy leaned in. Did they fight? Chris closed his eyes again. Bella, she fought. More silence. Tammy knew the truth, but she wanted him to say it. What did she say, Chris? Chris took a deep breath. She said, Daddy, please don't do to me what you did to Cece. Tammy's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. Chris ran a hand down his face, letting out a slow exhale. His face remained disturbingly still, but the truth was out now. Based on his statements, police obtained a search warrant for a remote oil site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, the location Chris had visited that Monday morning. A team of officers, forensic experts, and cadaver dogs arrived at the site. The dogs picked up a scent immediately. Within hours, investigators discovered Shanann's shallow grave. Nearby, they found two massive oil tanks. Inside, submerged in crude oil, were the bodies of Bella and Celeste. The search team was silent. The truth was undeniable. Chris Watts had murdered his entire family and discarded them as if they were nothing. Chris Watts was arrested that evening. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His interviews had been riddled with inconsistencies. His polygraph test was a disaster. His story had collapsed under pressure. As he sat in a holding cell, awaiting his fate, the world watched in horror. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico were gone, and the man who was supposed to love them had taken their lives. Inside a packed courtroom in Greeley, Colorado, Chris Watts sat motionless. His orange jumpsuit contrasted sharply against the pale walls of the Weld County Courthouse. He was flanked by his attorneys, but he looked alone. There would be no trial. Chris Watts, now 33 years old, had reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to 9 felony charges, 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Shanann, 1 for Bella, 1 for Celeste, and 2 additional counts under Colorado law for children under 12. 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy for the murder of his unborn son, Nico. 3 counts of tampering with the deceased body. The plea stunned the courtroom. Just months earlier, he had portrayed himself as a grieving husband and father, pleading for their return. Now, with the world watching, he admitted to taking their lives. The judge read through each charge, one by one. Chris barely moved. When asked how he pleaded, his response was barely audible. Guilty. Each time, his voice was lower. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Zuchek, sat in the front row. Sandra held her hands together, gripping a tissue tightly. Frank kept his eyes locked on the defendant. There was no relief in hearing the guilty plea. It did not bring their daughter or granddaughters back. But it did mean one thing. Chris Watts would never be free again. On the sentencing day, the courtroom was silent as Weld County District Judge Marcelo Kopkow entered. He took his seat, then turned his attention to the man in the orange jumpsuit. Chris Watts did not look up. For the first time since his arrest, he appeared visibly shaken. His legs bounced under the table. His hands trembled. Judge Kopkow did not waste time. This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases I have seen. The judge's voice was measured, but there was no mistaking the disgust in his tone. Shannon's parents were given the chance to speak. Sandra Zuchek's voice wavered as she addressed the court. He took away my daughter, my grandchildren. He took away my son-in-law. He was our son. Why? Why did he do this? I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. Frank Zuchek followed. His voice was low, controlled. I trusted you to take care of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and you took them out like trash. The weight of their words filled the courtroom. Chris stared down at his hands. He never turned to face them. Then it was time for sentencing. Judge Kopkow took a deep breath. Christopher Watts, I sentence you to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 to run consecutively, 2 to run concurrently. There was no reaction from Watts. Judge Kopkow continued. For the unlawful termination of pregnancy, an additional 48 years. For tampering with the bodies, 36 years total. The sentences meant that Chris Watts would spend the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of ever being released. The courtroom remained silent as the judge finished speaking. No one objected. No one protested. Justice had been served. But it did not bring closure. In the public reaction, outside the courthouse, reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, delivering breaking news updates. The case had gripped the nation for months. What started as a missing persons case had turned into one of the most horrifying family murders in recent history. News stations played clips of Chris's earlier interviews, the ones where he had begged for Shanann and the girls to return. They contrasted sharply with the cold, emotionless confession he later gave to police. Public outrage was swift. Social media was flooded with comments condemning Watts. How could someone do this to their own family? Why didn't he just leave if he wanted a new life? This man should never see the light of day again. People were horrified not only by the crime, but by the calculated way Chris had attempted to cover it up. And then there was Nicole Kessinger. Chris's mistress had gone into hiding, reportedly fearing for her life. When her name was released to the media, she became the target of relentless harassment. I had no idea he was still married, she told police in her only recorded interview. He lied to me. I believed him. But for many, it didn't matter. She had become part of the story. And like Chris Watts, her life would never be the same. Chris Watts was sent to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, after officials deemed it too dangerous for him to remain in Colorado. Inside, he was placed in protective custody. For months, he refused to speak to anyone. Then, in February 2019, he sat down with investigators once again. This time, he told the full truth. In chilling detail, he described what really happened that night. He admitted that killing Shanann had not been a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had planned it. He had made up his mind. And as for Bella and Celeste, they woke up, he confessed. They knew something was wrong. Investigators listened, but there was nothing left to do. Chris Watts was never leaving prison. The interview ended, and he was escorted back to his cell. He would spend the rest of his days behind locked doors, surrounded by men who knew exactly what he had done. He would never be a free man again. In the Watts family home, the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail remained untouched for months after the murders. No one wanted to live there. Potential buyers refused to step inside. It was eventually foreclosed and put back on the market, but its history lingered. Even today, it remains a symbol of tragedy. A reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors happen not in dark alleyways or unfamiliar places, but within the walls of a home where a family was supposed to be safe. Chris Watts had no history of violence. There were no documented signs of abuse, no criminal record, no reports of aggression. To the outside world, he was an average husband, a doting father, a man who lived a quiet, uneventful life. But on August 13, 2018, he did something that defied all logic. Experts in criminal psychology and forensic psychiatry have analyzed his case extensively, trying to understand how a man with no violent past could suddenly become capable of erasing his entire family. His actions were not those of a man who simply lost control in a fit of rage. They were methodical, they were planned, and they followed a pattern seen before in a specific type of offender, a family annihilator. Men who commit familicide do not all share the same motives, but their crimes often fit within distinct psychological categories. Some kill to punish their spouse for perceived wrongs. Some do it because they see their family as an extension of their own social or financial success, and when that success is threatened, they believe the family must be removed. Others believe external forces are closing in, that they have no way out, and they make a decision they believe is the only solution. Chris Watts, however, was different. He didn't seem to fit neatly into any single profile. Yet his motives were painfully clear. He had a life he wanted to erase and another life he wanted to create. When he met Nicole Kessinger, it wasn't just an affair, it was an escape. He told her he was going through a divorce. He painted a picture of a broken marriage, one that was ending naturally, when in reality, Shanann had no idea he was seeing someone else. For the first time in years, Chris Watts had stepped outside the role of the devoted husband and father. He was living two lives, one with Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and another with Kessinger. And in his mind, only one of them could survive. Experts believe this is where the psychological shift happened. Chris had convinced himself that his marriage was over. He had begun to speak about Shanann in the past tense to Kessinger. He told her that soon they would have a future together, one free of the obligations he had been carrying for years. He imagined himself as someone else, someone who could simply start over without consequence. But as long as his family existed, that life wasn't possible. In his mind, there was only one way forward. What makes this case so unsettling is not just what he did, but how he acted afterward. In the hours, days, and weeks following the murders, Chris Watts showed no signs of genuine grief. Even during his confessions, his voice remained flat, his expressions empty. When he described killing Shanann, there was no hesitation, no emotion. When he spoke about his daughters, he recounted their final words with the same detachment as if he were reading a script. He admitted that Bella had fought for her life, that she had pleaded with him not to do what he had just done to Celeste. But he did it anyway. Psychologists believe that Chris displayed traits of narcissistic personality disorder, a condition characterized by a lack of empathy, a need for control, and an inability to handle personal failure. He was not a man who reacted impulsively. He was a man who saw his family as an obstacle, and he removed them in the most permanent way possible. His decision was not about anger or hatred, but about convenience. When asked why he didn't simply divorce Shanann, why he didn't just walk away instead of taking their lives, his response was chilling. He said he didn't want to deal with the consequences. To him, murder was easier than explaining himself. The terrifying reality is that this crime did not happen in isolation. There were warning signs, but they were not the kind that typically raise alarms. Shanann sensed something was wrong. She felt Chris pulling away. She suspected an affair, but she never could have imagined what he was capable of. And that's what makes cases like this so dangerous, because the greatest threat doesn't always come from the places we expect. It comes from the people we trust the most. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life behind bars. There will be no parole, no second chance. He will wake up every day in a cell, surrounded by walls that will never change, knowing that his name is now synonymous with betrayal, vast with manipulation, with an act so cold that even seasoned investigators struggle to comprehend it. But even though he will never walk free again, the scars he left on his family and the nation will never fade. The house where he once lived, where his daughters played, where his wife slept beside him, still stands. It has become a silent reminder of what happened there, of the lives that were stolen within its walls. What is certain is that this case has forced many to rethink what they believe about domestic violence, about warning signs, about the thin line between the person we think we know and the truth of what they are capable of. Because no matter how perfect a family may seem from the outside, the reality behind closed doors is sometimes something else entirely. This case leaves us with so many questions. What do you think led Chris Watts to do this? Was this something he had planned? Or was it a decision made in the moment? Was there ever a point where he could have stopped himself? And perhaps the biggest question of all, could this have been prevented? If you found this deep dive compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We cover real cases, real crimes, and the psychology behind them, bringing you the stories that continue to haunt us long after they've ended. And if you think this case was shocking, wait until you see what we're covering next. In our next video, we'll be exploring another true crime story, one with twists and turns that no one saw coming. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Lastly, we want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about this crime, the warning signs, and what justice truly means in a case like this.